Judge Elizabeth Berns, and I am a general jurisdiction judge in Seattle, Washington, where our county serves 2 million people in the greater Seattle area. So I have a very large bench, have worked on criminal and civil rotations, on family rotations, and currently sit as the dependency and family treatment court judge in our South County Court. I know my esteemed colleagues, Judge Anderson and Judge Rosa, are on the line, so I just give them a moment to introduce themselves.
Berryl, I'm going to jump in then, just to keep things moving. I'm Judge Jan Rosa, retired from Buffalo, New York, was on the bench for about 20 years and presided over domestic violence cases as well as child welfare and every other thing that can be involved with family courts and the litigants who come in front of us. Judge Anderson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Berryl Anderson, the Chief Magistrate Judge here in DeKalb County, Georgia. My court hears a variety of matters, but we hear all protective orders in the county by designation as Superior Court judges. We also hear criminal warrant application hearings, and we issue all of the arrest, search warrants, and bond conditions and bond-related matters. And I've been with the court doing this work for 18 years, and I'm honored to be on this call.
Great. Thank you so much. And I also want to give a shout out and express my gratitude for Dr. Peter Jaffe, and I've had the honor of co-presenting with him on some of what I'll be speaking about today, and he's provided a lot of his materials to me on trauma, so you'll see some of those coming up. Where I'd like to start is to sort of share with you that when it comes to judicial leadership and supporting and creating trauma-informed courts, which is really about system change, organizational change around trauma exposure, a lot of the audience and a lot of folks around look a little bit like this ostrich with their head in the sand. There's a lot of resistance and a lot of hesitation and concern about talking about trauma and being able to address it in a responsible manner. For those of you that were on our webinar last week, I think you'll agree with me that it was really wonderful to speak about our trauma exposure as judicial officers and what that might feel like and look like for us and the kinds of things that we can do to take care of ourselves. And now we're looking at our role in our courts and in the justice system as a whole. And I think historically with our courts and also with our Western culture, talking about trauma has been taboo. If you look back in the history of the court system and the psyche, if you will, the behavior and the role of judges, it's been one that's been unemotional, with impersonality and dispassion central to neutrality, legal authority, and legitimacy. So really having a bench that is very unemotional, and somehow or another that was believed to lead to a greater capacity to make good decisions in that role. At that time, and still for some people, there's a belief that bringing the emotional aspect into the work we do can lead to irrational experiences and decisions, that it can be disorderly, certainly runs a risk of being impulsive and too personal, and therefore the belief at the time was that it was inconsistent with the legitimate exercise of the authority that were granted in our positions. But what we've learned quite wonderfully is that this indeed isn't the best practice, and it's actually quite harmful to try and separate out our very human qualities from the work that we do. The Emotions and Judging Project was a wonderful project that came out several years ago. I'll pass the link on to all of you after our webinar if you're interested. That really found, after doing a lot of surveying and research, that by neglecting that part of things, the emotional and the interactive components of being a judge, there were very negative consequences on how judges viewed and performed their work. I think we're learning that we have to pay attention and address taking care of ourselves, as we all spoke about last week. And in doing so, that impacts how we treat others. And most certainly, there has been this evolution around awareness of this reality. It's a delicate balance between being real with our emotions and acknowledging the emotions and experiences of those in our courtroom and working in our courts, with being mindful of our own demeanor and our behavior, acting responsibly. Not only does it imply ethics of the judiciary, but it also requires us to be mindful that we're not re-traumatizing the people around us. Last week, so as a review, Judge Rosa really hit initially on these concepts of burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, all very similar, having to do with the work that we do on a daily basis, how we're impacted, and how trauma can take a very cumulative toll on our system. There are so many opportunities that we have to be exposed to secondary trauma and receive traumatized individuals coming into our court. And the areas that are listed here are really high concentration areas. Both Judge Rosa and Judge Anderson have worked in those areas. Judge Anderson continues to work in those very highly concentrated trauma exposure areas, and many of all of you as well. And this not only is about people coming into our court who have been traumatized through their experiences seeking relief, but also having to do with the people that work in our court system, whether it's court clerks, security officers, interpreters, bailiffs, and all sorts of personnel depending on how your court is structured. I think we would all agree that we do not see people at their best when they come into our system, when they come through our courthouse doors. Very commonly, we're seeing people at their worst, and that the courthouse is frequently the last resort for many. They're emotionally spent, they're financially spent, and they're exceptionally vulnerable. And that translates into the experiences that we all have in working with individuals coming into our court in that state of mind. So as a review, vicarious trauma or secondary trauma has not only short and long-term consequences, when we're working with others who have been directly traumatized and are sharing their experiences. They're sharing their photographs, their stories, and the effects of vicarious trauma can be physical, emotional, can show up in our behavior, in our thoughts, in our thought process, interpersonally and also spiritually. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a cumulative toll that trauma takes in our system. The experience that all of our court personnel and certainly that we have on the bench is really parallel to those experiences of trauma survivors. And that involves a very wide range of feelings and reactions. Compounding that is not just, includes our day-to-day showing up at work, doing our jobs, but also our own life situations and individual circumstances or personal circumstances, and then organizational factors and factors within a community. And the intersection of all of this really creates a compounding effect. Last week, Judge Rosa touched on the study that was done on judges in particular and how judges are coping with the secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Female judges scored higher on internalizing factors than male judges, and judges who've been on the bench 7 or more years really scored higher on externalizing factors. So this is just important information, and it goes to the context of how we take leadership in this area and also how we create system change and how we create trauma-informed courts. As you'll remember from last week, some of the short-term symptoms of vicarious trauma, think about yourselves, but also think about others that you're working with very closely, whether it's in your courtroom or in your court offices. It can bring up flashbacks. People can get very angry, very edgy. Some can be very sad and depressed. There can be a sense of helplessness, certainly a withdrawal. Frequently people are losing sleep, and there's a lot of anxiety. And when you add all of that up in the short term and consider that each individual working in your system is experiencing this, it should give you the sense that something really ought to be done and support needs to come in. In the long term, we might see folks kind of turning cynical, being a little bit fearful. There might be a loss of faith in humanity. Certainly, the opportunities to abuse alcohol and drugs is on the rise, and it becomes very difficult to maintain intimate relationships. And that's certainly why it's so important for us to practice some of those trauma care techniques that we shared with each other last week. So in coping and thinking about what we do ourselves and what we support, how we support others around us, I have a question for all of you. What strategies work for you, or what ideas have you learned from others in coping as a judicial officer with what you're experiencing? You can use your chat box to type that in, and everyone will have the benefit of seeing some strategies that you're working with.
Elizabeth, this is Jan Rosa. One of the things that I cultivated really, really early in my practice was to make a decision with all the information I had available to me, make the best possible decision I could, even if it was tough, and do it and be done with it, and compartmentalize it and push it off so that I didn't, except in rare times, did I take it home and continue to chew on it or second guess myself or wonder if, or maybe I should have, because that was so wearing and exhausting as a new judge that I took to heart a Texas judge who used to, appellate judge who used to say, rule and run. And just make a decision the best you can at the moment and stop questioning it afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great strategy. Any other strategies that folks are thinking of? How about what you're doing to help your colleagues who aren't reaching out for support but need help? So when you see other judicial officers who might be reflecting some of the symptoms that we're aware of, what are people doing in reaching out?
This is Berryl Anderson. What I'd like to do is invite them to lunch or dinner away from the courthouse so that we can have an open, honest, and safe conversation about what's really going on. I think that when you're around the courthouse, you have to put on that, oftentimes you have to put on that, I call it the mask. And so you see your colleagues in the elevator, in the hallway, and they act like everything is all right, but everyone around them is fully aware that they're not okay because of, and they're displaying some of the symptoms that was on the list that you mentioned earlier about being angry and edgy and just not quite themselves. So it is helpful to get them away from the courthouse and to make them feel that they're in a safe space so that they can share.
Yeah, that's great too. And I see someone's posted up, try to start a dialogue. And doing that in a safe space, I think is really important. And Judge Anderson, you just spoke to that. What advice would you give new judges when they're starting out regarding trauma exposure and trauma care? I think one of the things that's important with new judges is to include in judicial orientation in your court, if you have, or if you have a judicial college for your state, a presentation on trauma exposure, vicarious trauma, and how that shows up. Some of what we're doing in our webinars here are going to be helpful. There's a posting that talks about having a mentor. That's an excellent idea. And a mentor who's not only willing to just support a new judicial officer with the practical challenges of being on the bench when perhaps they weren't, but also a mentor who's able to speak to these very meaningful experiences and very sort of precious moments of realization of what you're working with.
Mentoring, I think, is awesome, and sometimes it's the mentor that the supervising judge chooses for the new judge or commissioner, and sometimes it's the person that you find who is compatible with you to ask those private questions. I think that the important thing is creating an atmosphere where that kind of exchange and looking for support is considered the way we do business as opposed to something weird and unusual. Berryl, it sounds as if that's something that you've worked on in your group as a supervisor.
Yes, and also statewide, we a couple of years ago began making it mandatory that all new judges are assigned a mentor, and it's about a 6-month process where you spend a lot of time together and creating actually someone that you can rely on, and you become friends over time and know that it's someone that you can call at any time of day or night. And while it was forced early on, the Magistrate Council has done a really good job of pairing people with similar personalities and similar strengths and making sure that those mentor relationships work.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think, when we talk about and we contemplate judicial leadership, really being able to support those mechanisms of coping, whether it's mentoring, creating opportunities to have meaningful dialogue in a safe space, having individuals coming in or running programs in your court. These are all ways that we can be leaders and sort of demonstrate what we feel is the best practice around trauma care in these very highly, intensely traumatized containers that we work in, if you will. So last week, as a capture of kind of what we came out with, some of the suggestions were making sure we create balance. And Judge Rosa spoke about that in terms of really compartmentalizing, letting things go, moving on, bringing exercise into your routine humor, and having your spiritual life be supportive, having very positive community activities that you participate in, and really working, again, on your professional development. And there's all sorts of things that go into that category from what we were sharing last week. And all of these things we need to do as judicial officers and leaders in our court, because, as we know, it's critical that we take care of ourselves and model that kind of care before we can turn to others and be supportive. It's the theory of when the oxygen mask drops, you put your own on before you assist the person next to you in putting their oxygen mask on. So in looking at what we can do in our court system, knowing first we've got to take care of ourselves and acknowledge that we have significant exposure to trauma and that there is a cumulative toll, we need to start looking at the effects of trauma on youth and families and staff, acknowledging that, creating supportive practices in our operations so that we can not only address where people stand as to their current exposure, but hopefully minimize re-traumatization and really support an environment that creates a healing opportunity within the limitations of what we do in our system. And Judge Anderson, before I talk about in particular what we did in King County on our trauma care, I wanted to ask if you would be willing to share your experience of going through your system anonymously, what you did and what you observed.
Yes. Back in 2010, I made a conscious decision to walk through our protective order application process through the eyes of a victim. So I changed the way I dress a little bit. I dressed down a bit and entered the courthouse through the front of the courthouse. I went through the metal detector and really tried to be in character, if you will, and just look at the process through the lens of a victim. And it was incredibly confusing. It was very intimidating. And I say that not because of the personnel. I mean, the personnel, they were very helpful, but if I were a victim, there were just so many steps and so many hoops that you had to jump through to try to get help. The area where I had to complete the protective order petition was very noisy. It was really unsettling because it was located near 4 elevators, and if I were concerned about my abuser coming to the courthouse, I mean, it would have happened right in that very area. And so after going through the entire process and looking at the fact that it took nearly 2.5 hours, I had a chance to sit down with some of the stakeholders and community, some of our community agencies, and figured out a better process so that victims had advocacy from the moment they stepped into the courthouse. Our clerk of court was kind enough to provide a safe, quiet space for victims to complete their applications. And we just made some common sense changes and doubled up on judges during those times that we've identified are some of the busiest, and just made it all very victim focused. I encourage everyone, if you've not done that, that you should actually do that. And it was really, for those folks who recognized me, it did not take long for the courthouse rumor will, if you will, to hear that Judge Anderson had gotten a protective order. And so people that I've known for years who would stare me in the face were just kind of avoiding eye contact. And there was a sense of, I felt a sense, I'm sure it was just a small touch of what a true victim feels like having to go through this process. And I felt, you know, people were whispering and they thought that I really got a protective order. And so it was enlightening in many, many ways. And I encourage many of you judges and commissioners to walk through your own process so that you can identify some of the gaps. It really changed the way we've done things here in DeKalb County, and my eyes have been opened in a way that that'll never be changed.
And that's an incredibly powerful exercise that you went through there, and to have the opportunity then to come back around and meet with people and talk about your experience, really, really, really profound. And for those of you that are perhaps in much smaller communities but are still connected with courts and your fellow judicial officers in other communities, it might be possible for you to go through that exercise in another neighboring court, and then have an agreement with that bench that you'll sort of share your experiences and invite the same. So there's different ways to go about that. But overall, exceptionally profound experience. I want to share a little bit with you about a trauma care project that we started several years ago in King County Superior Court in Seattle, and in our court in Kent. So we have 3, just to give you a sense of the size, as I mentioned initially, we serve 2 million people in our county, in our one court, and we have 4 locations. We have our main courthouse is in Seattle. You can see the picture on your slide there. We have another courthouse in Kent, and then we have a juvenile court in a different location, and then we have a very small couple of courtrooms in Harborview Hospital where we deal with the involuntary treatment matters. So we serve a large community and we have multiple locations, and we have about 1,000 people working in our court system as staff or personnel. So it's a large operation. And the way we started this project was about 4 years ago. We tapped into the great support and resources with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And we asked for a trauma audit for our juvenile court in particular, a very high concentration of trauma there. And we wanted to look at assisting others and efforts to create trauma-responsive environments, practices, and policies. And a lot of what we were looking at doing is something that Judge Anderson just mentioned she was noticing when she came into her courthouse. So the environment around her, how she was received, and some of the sentiment that followed her when she went through that system. Similarly, we look to the experience of families and juveniles coming into our court system to try and look at where we needed to concentrate our efforts. What came out of that trauma audit were some very important recommendations. The first, probably one of the most important, was the need to start training our staff and each other on trauma, what traumatic stress looked like and felt like, and how we needed to enhance and improve our interpersonal skills when trauma was in the mix. We also received a recommendation to look at the organizational trauma history of our court. And this really goes to having an important context within which we needed to do the work. And then to do the practical hands-on work of developing very trauma-specific policies and protocols. So this was an audit that took place in 2014, as I said, in our juvenile court. And a couple years ago, we took the juvenile court audit and asked how we could take some of these recommendations and roll them out on a larger scale through the remainder of the court, through the courts that were dealing with criminal cases, with family cases, with domestic violence and sexual assault matters, and how we could roll it out into a much larger court-wide scale. We started that inquiry by sending a survey out across the court, and I mean to every person that works in our court at every level, so it's not a survey to the bench, but across the court, asking people about what mattered to them in working in the court, what changes they would like to see to improve our system and to improve our work environment. And the result of that survey was the creation of a specific strategic agenda item that our court supported that included a priority to address trauma and the toll that trauma takes on each person working in our courts. So once we had that agenda and that commitment court-wide now, we developed a team. It was a volunteer team formed to talk about how we could not only implement some of the recommendations that we were benefiting from the survey in juvenile court, but also a way that we could start addressing the rising pressure of vicarious trauma and systematic oppression. And our team, quite wonderfully, was comprised of just a few judicial officers, and I mean 2 to 3 at the most. We had interpreters, we had mediators working for court, we had court clerks and bailiffs, we had security representation, management, facilitators with our domestic violence and family court divisions. Really a great representation of the different sectors of our court that came together as a team. That team then invited Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. You'll remember Judge Rosa spoke about Laura in her presentation. And in recognizing that the training was probably at the very top of our list, we brought her in to do a symposium. And we had across the board, we did it in 2 different locations, we had 1,000 attendees total in that symposium. And this was a way, for the very first time in our court, with the exception of the trauma audit that we requested for our juvenile court, but it was a way to speak about trauma that had not been done before and to acknowledge that we were experiencing that in our system. That acknowledgement in and of itself was profound and very powerful. We were quick to do follow-up after we had our training sessions. We worked with Laura to do smaller brown bags on that. And we sent another survey around and asked people if after they had learned more and received training and started to increase their awareness, if they had made any changes in how they were going through their day, in their practices, in their self-care, to manage that impact of trauma exposure. And 81% of that very large group of people said they had made changes. And we asked if their perspectives and their feelings had changed after receiving some education about trauma and the importance of being stewards in this area. And 81% had indicated that that their thoughts and feelings and perceptions changed. So clearly a very profound impact, a very important and meaningful impact, and very empowering for all of us in the system. In terms of bringing somebody in and what we did with Laura, when we had the trauma audit from NCJ, FCJ, we were able to get some funding for that work in our juvenile court, and we tapped into some of that funding for our juvenile court to bring Laura to our court-wide community. And so we were able to maximize the resources that we had for the one project to create a very widespread impact. So that's how we funded Laura, and because we have identified in our court that our trauma stewardship and our trauma care project is a priority, and it continues to be a priority, then we include any ongoing work in that area, and if there is a cost to that in our budgeting for our court, to the best of our ability. As a follow-up to the work that we did with Laura, we started to implement brown bag meetings across the court so smaller groups could have discussions and create relationships. It's another opportunity where dialogue could happen and people could share their experiences with each other in a smaller and safe environment. We started to implement some meeting strategies within high trauma impact departments. Excuse me. An example of this is in our family law department. The way that that department had their department-wide meetings started out very differently after our awareness of trauma and trauma exposure was improved. We started talking initially with each other and checking in with each other about how things were going. We shared areas where we were grateful and went around the table and expressed gratitude for certain things, and that was the way that we started our meetings. And just that shift was very profound. We included discussions in our hiring of people, bringing people into the court about trauma stewardship and trauma care, alerting those that were interested in coming and working in our court system that it was a high trauma area, highly concentrated, and what that would mean and that they needed to be aware of that. That was something that had never been done before. People sort of found out as they went through their tenure. And we also identified some quiet rooms, and I think that Judge Rosa might have mentioned that just a short while ago in terms of having some space to be able to step out while still being in the courthouse and take some time just to slow down and shift and tend to your own needs. We then needed to make some very specific recommendations to sustain our commitment to trauma stewardship. And this is important because I think we would all agree that when you start to talk about this and to share about your experiences and the impact those experiences of others have on you, you open up almost an emotional Pandora's box, if you will. And the larger number of people in your system, the greater that opening is. And we realized that we needed to be responsible in doing that and develop a sustained commitment to tend to that over time. So we agreed to incorporate trauma awareness and stewardship into our new employee orientation, our new judicial officer orientation, and our volunteer orientation. As an example, we have court-appointed special advocates in our dependency and family departments. Those are all volunteers who have a high likelihood of being exposed to very traumatic circumstances and experiences of others. And we've also just started to add and revisit a trauma awareness and stewardship with our juries that are coming into our court system as well. In addition, we made a commitment moving forward to embed trauma awareness tools into all of our system resources, to establish a standing committee, so move from a strategic agenda item into having an actual court committee in perpetuity. We developed a SharePoint site with information and references which we maintain and we update, and then we started to develop some jury information. And I want to share a snapshot. It's probably very difficult for you to see the details of this, but what I just want you to see is this is a screenshot of our SharePoint site on our court's website. It's an internal site, so if you're working within the court, then you're going to be able to access this. And it talks about being a trauma-informed court. On the right side, there are resources. We've uploaded different articles and materials. On the left side, we have web links for people to click on to get them excuse me, to different resources and materials. And then we also developed and created a video. We used our own court people in doing this, our own court staff who were willing to participate in creating a video as a place where people could go on their own or in groups and receive information about what this looked like and how important it was, and again, speak to acknowledging the existence of trauma in our court system. And with the assistance of our great tech staff, I'd like to play this video for you. It's a short video, and I'm going to let Patricia or Heather explain to you how you're going to tap into this and hear the video.
Hi, thank you. So for this portion of our webinar, we will be playing a 6-minute video, and so we ask all participants to please raise your computer speakers to hear the audio. Unfortunately, if you are only dialed in via phone, you will not hear the audio playing. And if for any reason you do not hear audio playing through your computer speakers, I have provided a YouTube link in the chat box where you can access the video clip. So feel free to open that link and you can follow along. And I think we can wait 10 to 20 seconds after the video ends on our end just to ensure that everyone is caught up with the video. Okay, thank you.
And should we mute our telephones if we're listening to the video?
So for all the presenters, please mute your phone lines. That is correct.
Secondary trauma is the impact of being firsthand with people sharing their stories of trauma, being exposed on a regular basis to some pretty horrific things that have happened to people in the course of their lives.
I have worked for the court for over 25 years. I worked in detention for 6 years, and I worked as a community surveillance officer, as a probation counselor for 18 years. I've worked with thousands. For each one of them, you know, there's at least one offense, which might be minimal, or it might be, you know, some pretty grisly things that people do to each other. And they also all have their own stories. Horrible, horrible stories of abuse and neglect. I definitely have heard things that impact me, you know, where, you know, you cry sometimes and, you know, you get mad, you're shocked, you're, every emotion. I had a young man on my caseload die of an overdose, and it surprised me. I would have never guessed, but within a week or two, I was having my own PTSD.
Secondary trauma resembles post-traumatic stress disorder. Anxiety, a sense of not being safe, maybe a sense of the world being a terrible place, losing your sense of hopefulness, and like that. Kind of the cumulative effect over time, secondary trauma begins to change sort of your sense of yourself in the world. Where you might have been hopeful and optimistic, start becoming more and more pessimistic and negative about things.
You read police reports with sometimes violent, really tough to read incidents. You're meeting with kids and families that have endured a lot in their lives. The stuff we deal with and hear about and read about, it does affect us. The secondary trauma for me, I don't think I deal with very well, to be honest with you. So when I go home, sometimes I just don't want to talk about anything, which is not particularly healthy for the marriage and the family. I am shut down. and I think my wife would use that word, shut down, grumpy. My kids even...
Sometimes secondary trauma gets called compassion fatigue, and so it's sort of like your ability to be present and have your heart fully there with somebody becomes muted.
I was coming to the courthouse because Child Protective Services became involved in my life due to child abuse and neglect. I was required to come to court on a monthly basis. The overall feeling I would get would be fear, stress, anxiety. There's a buzz that kind of happens in the courthouse that it's an overwhelming feeling. Coming into a courthouse, not knowing what's going on with your children was very stressful. On top of everything that you're doing, you have to deal with court staff. I'm required to be here, so I am here, and I wouldn't get any eye contact. And sometimes not being able to get any kind of answers or being made feel like I was not even a person, you know, just a number or something like that, did not make me feel very well.
I think back when I started a long time ago, there was a mentality of, you know, you just have to be strong, and if you can't cope, then you're weak. When I was working in drug court, I would get tremendously stressed out about the youth on my caseload and worrying about, you know, what am I going to do? How can I help them? And I just had horrendous insomnia, horrible insomnia. I actually did go through counseling. I did about 3 years of counseling.
For a lot of professionals, the ability to turn off that thinking. They are off work, but they're still doing the work in their heads. They're having unanticipated memories and flashes of the traumatic stories they've heard. Off work, practicing mindfulness or yoga or walking thoughtfully, taking some time to be in the moment, to be in the now, and to appreciate what you're experiencing now, and to get out of the sort of cycle of repeating the horrible events.
Exercise is important for me, kind of outside of the workplace, which I try to do, and just being intentional with myself, acknowledging that specific things that I've encountered in the day do affect me.
Exercise, what I eat has a big effect on how I function. So the better care that I can take of myself, the better care and stewardship that I can give other people.
Coming into a place that's positive, where people are maybe smiling and saying hello and giving you eye contact, and just being a positive person would have made it huge. Would have made me come to court more often.
So holding good boundaries and really being able to separate that I can compassionately bear witness to your story of trauma, and at the same time it's not my trauma. There's a boundary there.
Okay, I hope everybody was able to hear that video. Each time I watch that video, it's such a moving experience, and I think that we realized in our court that the support that we could provide each other was really exciting and very, very powerful. That it didn't take any additional personal resources to implement it. It did take a willingness to be honest and to be open with each other in a conscious and caring manner. We also have realized and continue to reaffirm that the trauma-informed work that we all can do collectively will re-energize us and change the course of how we live our lives and how we touch others through our work. And this reminds me of the starfish from Judge Rosa's presentation and the story that she shared. We've made a commitment to incorporate trauma stewardship in all our leadership programs at every level, to really pay attention to our crisis response and our response to workplace violence, to develop and train each other on peer-to-peer support and incident debriefing. So this includes circumstances where we may have an active shooter situation, or where we may have an earthquake, or circumstances that are outside of our anticipation and control, but nonetheless are traumatic. Our awareness and our ability to support each other, we realized, is key. That awareness and ability to support each other is also something that our Judicial Engagement Network offers. It's a national community that brings together judicial officers that are looking at leadership to improve the response and practices around domestic violence and sexual assault in particular, but in our courts, and the kind of work that we do and the support we can give to each other through Jen, as we affectionately refer to this network, will really translate quite beautifully across our court in whatever setting. There are great resources available through the network, and highly encourage all of you to participate and get involved. Judge Rosa and Judge Anderson, do you want to share some of your thoughts on the Judicial Engagement Network?
My main comment is that it's an incredible gathering of great minds with great energy, passion, and ideas. And there's not a person in the group that isn't willing to share and support. And it's a very low-key situation. There's nothing required of a member, but just knowing that you have support is helpful.
This is Judge Anderson. I'm a big proponent of creating a safe space for judges to be open and honest about their thoughts and just how they're doing. I think it was Jan said it last week in her segment that you become a judge and you lose some of your identity. You certainly lose your first name. And so it's a group of judges, some who have been on the bench 30 years, some 20 years, and some judges who have been on the bench for 6 months. But it's an opportunity for us to come together, have a safe space, and talk about our experiences and just to share and support one another. And I believe I mentioned last week that I have created a community within a community where there are about 10 judges that I communicate with, and we stay engaged once a month just to check on each other and to hold each other accountable about making sure that we are taking care of ourselves because self-care is so important. And it's very interesting that when we have to give our monthly report, some of us don't get that self-care piece in until like on the 28th or 29th day. But the important piece is that we get it in, and that's very important. So, and
Berryl, did you? Oh, I'm sorry. Berryl, did you just kind of find a group of like-minded folks and decide to all challenge yourself to do this? How did you find this?
When we came together as to meet as a group in, I believe it was the end of October, the Judicial Engagement Network, our first gathering. Several of us were concerned about self-care, so we sort of huddled together for about an hour and shared some of our experiences, and we were all on very different paths and had different experiences and different levels of our journey on the bench. But one thing that we had in common is that none of us were doing a good job with the self-care piece, and we made a commitment that we would exchange phone numbers and email addresses, and since October I've been checking in once a month, and you know, without giving too many details, one judge has become a personal trainer, another one's run a marathon, but it's a way for us to engage and feel okay about taking care of ourselves.
Is there a way that there could be similar kinds of virtual meetup groups created inside Gen that did the same kind of thing? And if so, how would interested people on this webinar go about that?
I'm probably the least technologically savvy person on this webinar, but
well, don't talk about tech. Talk about
okay.
How people might. You know, somebody says to you, "I'm interested in doing it too." You know, your group is 10. Is you don't want a group of 50. So, how might people do that?
I think that some of the more engaged individuals in my group, I can talk with them about if we can just create other groups, maybe an email, or have people just log on to Jen and say they're interested in having being part of a self-care group, then we can figure out a way to split it up.
Wonderful. That's a great idea. Thank you.
So Judicial Engagement Network is an incredible opportunity for judicial officers to come together and have these really meaningful conversations and provide support across the courts and across the nation in terms of what we're doing with this work. I think that it's important in supporting your efforts in your court, if you choose to do that work, that you invite individuals who really represent the different working departments of your court, so that there can be meaningful conversations in those divisions, open conversations in a trusted, safe space. I'm sure you can imagine, in my experience, as personable as I can be, was that if I approached a clerk or an interpreter as a judicial officer and started to have this conversation, there is a dynamic that doesn't lead to the openness that I think could happen if a clerk approached a clerk or an interpreter approached an interpreter. So we have to be aware that we are leaders, and we have to be smart about engaging others in this stewardship. Jen is a great resource to give you opportunities. Really, I think what we've acknowledged here is that we're all collectively affected by trauma through the work we do each day in whatever role we may play in our court system. And that effect can be compounded by the experience of trauma in our personal lives. By taking on leadership and working to create trauma-informed courts and bring trauma care into your court, it's an opportunity to create deeper compassion and greater ability. The magnitude of that collective suffering, we certainly felt it in my court here with the volume of people working in the court system and the great number in our community coming into our court system really demands that we support this kind of response. And each of us plays a role in meeting that response responsibly. Compassion is a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who's stricken by misfortune, and it's accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the differing. We can be a compassionate court, and what we do for others is profound. What we need to do for ourselves is essential. So make the commitment to yourself and your court staff. Start your work today in having conversations. There are great resources out there. In addition to what we've shared in our webinars these past 2 weeks, there's another link I want to share with you to the Trauma Stewardship Institute that Laura Lipsky runs, and I know that's going to be posted in just a moment here for everyone to see. There are a couple of books that Laura has written on trauma stewardship. It's traumastewardship.com is the link. There you go. The first book that she wrote, called Trauma Stewardship, is a everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. Using some of the money that we had received through our funding for the trauma audit, we purchased 500 copies of this book and made it available to our court staff and our bench in the courthouses that we have here, and created a sharing system with regard to that book. So that was an important resource and kind of a takeaway for people. You'll find information on that book on her site. She's also just written another book that is about to launch on June 10th. So if you go to her site, it talks about overwhelm and kind of working through overwhelm. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at the resources she has available. And in the very few minutes that we have remaining, I wanted to open up the floor, so to say, to any thoughts or comments from our participants, any questions, and certainly more comments and words from Judge Rosa and Judge Anderson. See some people typing.
This is Judge Anderson. While they're typing, I would like to encourage everyone on the call, and I see that a few have indicated that they really would like to be part of this self-care group, or having someone check in and hold them accountable. So please make sure that you write that here, and also reach out to Jen so that we can figure out a way to connect with you and to get you engaged and start you on the journey to taking better care of yourself.
You know, I think one of the things that I've noticed in working with the Trauma Care Project in my court is that it's a constant effort that you have to make to keep people engaged and to tend to the kind of support and resources that the court is offering. So it doesn't work just to have somebody come in and do a seminar and then not speak about it. It's all about putting these tools around self-care and also care of others, and shifting our system, its environment, into practice every single day.
Judge Berns, let me ask a question. You know, this was clearly a really robust program that's affected all of the people in the courtroom and who come into the courthouse. Do you think this is something that people would say, well, we'll be glad when this is over and we can go back to the way it used to be? Or do you think there's a strong enough momentum inside that they would fight tooth and nail to make sure this didn't go away?
It's a great question, and I think there's some people who are thinking, okay, well, we talked about that, now let's just get on with our business. And usually those are people that are back in that space of thinking that, you know, they're not affected by trauma. It doesn't impact them. The people around them seem to be fine, and so it doesn't, you know, they're moving forward, so to say. But for most people who have had the opportunity to be seen and have their experiences validated in our court system around trauma exposure and the toll it takes, those people are very committed to seeing the work move forward and be sustained. And relationships, interpersonal relationships in our court have changed because of this discussion. And once there's that change, there's really no going back, so to say.
Right. I think you've done a fabulous job there in your location of taking what's been out there in the field and bringing it home into the courthouse. As Steve on the call says, that, you know, it's been used in a variety of other professions, but it's only recently come into the court system, and to recognize the impact on court personnel. Be curious to see if court administration were to be able to see a difference in sick days, asks for transfers, those kinds of things. It would show up as a sort of wellness check. Be curious. Make it evidence-based at some point down the road.
Yeah, that would be great. That's a good idea, to go back and see if we can collect that data and create a causal link. So I think we're close to our time ending, and I would say to you all that this is important work. I encourage you to stick with it. It's very, very hard work that we do in this area, not only in our day-to-day jobs, but it's hard work to take on trauma care in your system, in your court system. There's so many different kinds of hurdles and barriers, but it's so worthwhile. And the ripple effect that it has that reaches far out into our communities, into our families and our communities, is profound and very long-lasting. So I encourage you all to do this good work.
Wonderful.